EMP Series, Day 159. Major Stillman was in the diner eating breakfast. He glanced at his watch. It was 6:50 a.m. He had an early morning meeting scheduled for 7. He poured the cup of coffee he just had refilled into his travel mug and walked out. He got in his Jeep and drove up toward the dam, about 3 miles out of town, like he had every week since he arrived here. He liked to arrive for this particular meeting a few minutes late. He preferred to get there when the person he was meeting was already there waiting. He didn't like the exposure that came with having to wait there himself. As he pulled off the road onto the gravel access road at the bottom of the dam, he noticed that the white van that belonged to the man he was scheduled to meet was not there. That's odd, he thought. Tyler Hobbs was just an undisciplined civilian, in the Major's opinion, but he had proven to be reliable and always punctual. He waited for about 10 minutes and grew frustrated and left. He couldn't risk being seen driving out to Tyler's house, so he headed back into town. Carl Fairley wasn't in his office yet, nor would he be anytime soon. He decided not to go into town today. Instead, he packed his saddlebags full of supplies and told Abigail he would be gone a couple days. He looked her square in the eyes, and he repeated, 2 days, honey, and nodded. She nodded back, and he knew that she knew. That meant that if he was not back by dawn on day 3, that she was to pull up the shade in the living room window. He hugged her and whispered, "Don't worry, honey. It's just a routine trip." Weren't they always, she thought. She just smiled, kissed him goodbye. She took a cloth napkin out of her coat pocket and handed it to him. "Your favorite chocolate chip cookies. Made them yesterday," she said. He smiled and slid them into his pocket. He looked at Zeb and told him to mount up and ride with him a ways. The two men took off toward the mountain. Carl proceeded to tell Zeb about the window shade signal. He told him about the man in Virginia and about how someone broke into his office yesterday. He told him almost everything. He told him more than he should have. He stopped on the trail about a mile or so from the house. He looked at Zeb and told him, "Son, what I have told you cannot be repeated to anyone, ever. I should not have even told you. By doing so, I have breached every security protocol in the book. You can't even tell your mom. She knows about the security procedure with the window shade and when and how to trigger it, but she does not know any of the other stuff that I just told you. I'm trusting you to hold this confidence. I'm still sorting out what all this means, but I need you to be ready. Be ready to step in if something happens to me. Your mom and brothers and sisters, I need you to take care of things." Zeb just nodded and said, "You can count on me, Dad." Carl smiled. "I know I can, son. I wouldn't have told you any of this if I didn't think I could. Now get back home. I'll see you in a couple days." Again, Zeb just nodded and rode off at full gallop. Carl headed further up into the mountains. Tyler Hobb and his men, those that were still alive, sat in the front room of his home, in chairs with their hands tied behind them with duct tape. Buddy Tanner sent 2 of his men into town to try to get a lead on Roger's whereabouts. They drove the van down to just outside town. They pulled off the road into the parking lot of an old abandoned mill factory and pulled the van around the back out of sight. They got out and put their backpacks on and started to hike into town along the railroad tracks. When they came to within sight of the trading post, they sat in the tree line and watched the activity on the platform. There was Jimmy Abbott, sitting on the bench, observing the activity as well. He did not see Buddy's men, nor would he know who they were if he did. The men saw him, but likewise had no clue yet who he was. Major Stillman walked out of his office and crossed the street to enter the building that housed Carl's office. He knocked on the door and rattled the handle when he received no response. He thought it odd that Carl wasn't in yet. It was now mid-morning, and Carl had never been this late, arriving for the day. He glanced back toward the post and saw Zeb heading over toward the diner. He yelled over to him to wait and walked over to greet him. He asked of Carl's whereabouts, and Zeb just replied that he was going to be out of the office for a few days. Major Stillman asked where he went and when he would be back. Zeb just shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'm not sure. County business, I assume." The major watched as Zeb walked away. He went into the diner. He sat at a booth by the window with a newspaper. He ordered a coffee and he looked out the window at Major Stillman's office. Carl had shared his growing suspicions of the major with Zeb and told him to be careful where he was concerned. Buddy Tanner's two men sat just beyond the tree line overlooking the post and the platform. One man set up a spot on the ridge and assembled his .30-06 scoped rifle. The second man slung his empty ruck over one shoulder and headed toward the platform. The shooter was concealed in the underbrush on the ridge and had a clear line of sight 300 yards to the platform and post. An easy shot for the trained sniper with this particular rifle. As his partner entered the training post, he watched through the rifle scope. They didn't anticipate any trouble. It was just a recon operation at this point, but the shooter was ready in case it went sideways. Inside the post, the MC member known as Hammer walked confidently up to the counter. He asked about posting a message and if they had a community board. The clerk pointed to the bulletin board behind him and told him he could post it there. That most everyone who came through here read it. He told him he was looking for his brother, who he got separated from during the EMP attack. He told the clerk he had a picture and he pulled it out of his shirt pocket. The picture he had of Roger was several years old, but he hadn't changed much in that time. The clerk paused as he studied the picture of Roger in his club cut, proudly displaying his airborne tattoo. "Yeah," he said. "He looks familiar. I think I've seen him." "Oh, that's great," replied Hammer. "Is he still here somewhere?" he asked. I haven't seen him in a couple weeks, I guess it's been." Hammer asked the clerk if he knew where he went, or any info that could be helpful finding him. The clerk told him that many people come and go, and he couldn't be sure. He only knew that he had not seen him in a while. Hammer stuck the picture back in his pocket and thanked the clerk. He turned around and headed for the door. He stopped briefly and turned to the clerk. "Hey, is there anywhere around here I can get a drink?" he asked. The clerk, looking around to make sure nobody was listening, responded, "Well, around here booze is illegal." You didn't hear it from me, but up the road a ways, he pointed north. There's an alley behind the feed store. Around back there's an old warehouse. Go to the overhead door and give a loud rap on it. When someone comes around the alley, they will show you in through a side door. Just tell them I sent you. Hammer nodded. The clerk nodded back as he smiled, seemingly happy to be getting something over on Major Stillman and his stupid rules. Carl Fairley rode up into the mountains. He stopped on a ridge that overlooked the valley and the trail he had just ridden up. He pulled out his binoculars and carefully scanned the area and the trail that led up to his position. Whoever was following him was good. Carl never saw him, but he knew he was there. Carl took a drink of water and rested for 5 minutes. He got up and climbed on his horse and descended over the other side of the ridge. About a half hour later, a lone rider crested the ridge as well and stopped to look down at the trail ahead. He didn't see Carl. Just as he had figured out what happened, he reached quickly for the rifle in his scabbard. Before he could draw it out, he was abruptly pulled from his horse. He was now laying on the ground on his back looking up at Carl Fairley, who was standing over him with his .45 pointed right at him. Carl had flanked left and doubled back behind him, tied his horse off in the rocks below, and snuck up behind him on foot. The rider realized what had happened when he crested the ridge and didn't see Carl, but it was too late. "Who are you and why are you following me?" "Carl Fairley. Relax," the man said. "I thought that was you, but I wasn't sure. I'm with Section 4. Carl looked at him for a moment and then proceeded to recite the weekly OPSEC code. "The wise old owl sat up in the oak." The man responded, "The more he saw, the less he spoke." Carl spoke again. "The less he spoke, the more he heard." The man responded a second time. "Wasn't that owl a wise old bird?" Then Carl said, 63987, with which the other man answered, 67240. Carl holstered his .45 and extended the man his hand and helped pull him to his feet. "I didn't expect to run into you way down here. By my estimation, we're a good 4 clicks from your post." "Yeah, that's about spot on. I'm on my way back from a security check on location 1. Come on, let's get to my post before nightfall." The 2 men mounted and rode up further into the mountains. They arrived at their destination just after dark. It was a small cabin in the middle of a vast mountain range, hidden well beneath a large pine grove. The man with Carl announced himself before they walked in. It was warm. There was a fire going in the wood stove and something smelled really good. Another man inside got up to greet them, and he was introduced to Carl. Leonard was the man who rode up with Carl. His partner Frank was cooking a big pot of chili, and the 3 sat down to eat. Section 4 was a covert security and observation detail. It consisted of 10 2-man teams spread out for miles throughout the region. This team, and one other, 10 or so miles away, were the only ones who knew who Carl Fairley was. They did not know his current mission or the details of his operation. They only knew they were there to run security for his op and provide support, if needed. Carl usually communicated with the control agent via the ham radio. When sensitive info needed to be passed, they had a system in place to accommodate that. Now, however, in light of the fact that someone broke into Carl's office and his cover may be blown, the protocols were changing. The man in the communications bunker in Virginia needed a file that Carl had. They couldn't trust their usual system for fear it may have been compromised. The backup protocol was for Carl to get the file to Section 4, and they could relay it to the control agent in Virginia. Carl, of course, would not know how this task would be carried out. He pulled the sealed manila envelope out of his saddlebag and handed it to Leonard. Carl informed them that he was going to make camp outside for the night. He would start out early for the long ride back home tomorrow. If all went well, he thought, he could be back tomorrow night, late sometime. Leonard invited him to roll out his sleeping bag on the floor in front of the wood stove, instead of sleeping outside in the cold. Carl agreed and thanked him.